My name is Dario Hasenstab. I'm here with Balder Hagritz, and we are back with the Western Bubble podcast. Today, we're talking about geopolitics of the Arctic, a topic that seems to be so important that it has its own Wikipedia article. But apart from that, Balder, why are we talking about this topic?
Hello, Dario. Well, we're talking about it practically because I'll be traveling next week and we're recording this episode a little bit earlier than usual. Usually we record it about 4 or 5 days before it gets published. Now it's like 10 days before it gets published. And because of that, we had to pick a topic that isn't necessarily about current affairs, because of course we cannot look into a crystal ball and know what's going to happen in the next 10 days. And the Arctic is one of many items on our list of issues that has certain Western bubble aspects to it, that is interesting from an IR perspective, and that I would guess a lot of listeners don't really know much about. So I think it's a very good topic to talk about when we don't do it about the news of the day.
Including myself, by the way. I have once proofread a thesis for a friend on the Arctic, but that was about it. And I read this very infamous Wikipedia article that I just referenced. I really hope that this topic will not become current before we publish this episode, because that would mean that there would be a serious military escalation or an escalation of sorts, which in the preparation of the episode, basically every article said that, oh, we're walking or sleepwalking into a conflict in the Arctic. Boulder, the Arctic hasn't really been the focus of any conflicts as far as I'm concerned lately. Why is this happening now?
Well, I would argue that those articles, and they've not just come out by the media in general, but also NATO has been pushing that narrative quite a bit lately. Those kinds of articles are very much part of bubble thinking. It is about the Arctic becoming more relevant geopolitically, just because of the unfortunate circumstances of global warming, which means that the ice caps are melting, which means that it's easier to access natural resources in the Arctic. But even more importantly, it's more likely that Russia and China are going to be able to establish the Northern Sea Route, the Northern Trade Route, which means that goods produced in China and Southeast Asia are no longer necessarily going through the Indian Ocean, but can actually go north of Siberia. And that makes the Arctic geopolitically particularly relevant, which in the past wasn't the case. In the past, it was mostly about polar bears and, some explorers trying to get to the North Pole, and that was about it. Why those articles about militarization or sort of the military tensions are being published is because it is a completely obvious fact that Russia is a dominant player there. Just geographically, it controls half of the Arctic border, and it's going to benefit tremendously from trade lanes. And that shouldn't be a source for military escalation, but the West feels uncomfortable with that. The West feels that now all of a sudden their enemy or their rival is being given a Christmas present, so to speak. They now have abilities that they didn't have before that will sort of shift the tide towards Moscow once again. And the West is uncomfortable with that, is concerned about that, and they are imagining all kinds of military conflicts as a result.
This is one of those times where I already know I'm really going to enjoy the episode because it is talking about one of the topics that I really enjoyed studying about in university, because there was a book, Prisoners of Geography, right? It's really easy to understand, like it's easy to read, it's easy to understand. All the instincts kind of are right about it. I really recommend reading, first buying it and then reading this book to all of our listeners. To kind of put a perspective onto this, right? So we're talking about the Arctic, not the Antarctica, right? So we're talking about the one in the north, not the one in the south. And then there is 8 countries that are kind of involved, directly involved.
But that have territory.
Yeah, that's what I meant with directly involved, right? So there's more involved, but directly involved through territory are the United States, Canada, Russia, Finland, the Kingdom of Denmark through Greenland, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden. An illustrious round of basically the West and Russia.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, the fact that the West is so dominant is purely, as you yourself just stated, a result of geography. It's not some kind of neo-colonial outcome, unless you argue that the United States and Canada are neo-colonial constructs, which I guess they are, right? Um, but it is just the fact that Europe and Russia and North America are the ones that are close to the Arctic, so they are the main players. There's nothing conspiratorial about that. However, what is very clear is that all the dynamics around it, including through the UN, but also the observer states within the Arctic Council, have a very clear Western bias, and the global South is not very well presented. It's countries like France and Britain that have quite an important voice in these matters, even though they don't have territory in the Arctic. And China is one of the few, if you like, non-Western observers in that sense. So there is certainly a Western dominance within the politics of the Arctic, and Russia is certainly the odd one out. So that you've got these Western countries versus Russia typically, but there is absolutely no reason why that is the case beyond those eight territorial members. There's no reason why countries like India or South Africa or Nigeria shouldn't have more of a say in Arctic matters if France and the UK have that as well.
Because ultimately, Western countries are usually observers to organizations elsewhere on the planet that don't directly involve them, but it's really good to be an observer there.
Exactly, and especially given that it's going to be more important because of natural resources as a source of oil and other types of production extraction, as well as it's going to shift potentially the way that global trade works by going through the northern route. The global South is absolutely going to be affected. It's going to be sort of a stakeholder, as they say, right? Not a shareholder, but a stakeholder of these events. And it would make perfect sense to involve them more.
Because this is, to really dive into this point now about why this is suddenly, and when I talk about suddenly, I mean in geopolitical terms. So over the last few years, the Arctic has become more important, as you mentioned, because of climate change. Or global warming, to be more specific. All the ice there is melting, which leads to one thing, as you said, is that trade routes that were previously covered by ice are opening up. So as of now, most of the global trade, right, is happening through large parts of the Pacific and of the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. But there's not really any trade happening, basically, right, going above, as usually planes do, right? The planes usually go above, because it's a lot shorter, and this is not possible via ship right now. But the moment that ice melts, let's go, ready to go. It will make the trade routes shorter, cheaper. You will have an alternative to maybe passages that are controlled and therefore blocked by certain actors.
And this is particularly important, knowing that the most important consumer market for China is the European Union, or at least the European area. For China to be able to ship its products there without any geopolitical tensions relating to India, relating to the Middle East, the Suez Canal, relating to Sub-Saharan Africa, that would make life an awful lot easier. It would boost the Chinese geopolitical position quite substantially. And it would give Russia an awful lot of control over that. Also responsibility, because they're the ones who have to police it. But it basically is a natural shift towards China and Russia, which is of course in line with the geopolitical shift that we're seeing, where the West is losing influence and losing terrain. And in that sense, it reinforces the observations we already are witnessing elsewhere in the world.
Because that's exactly the point. You said it so nicely, policing, right? I mean, there's one country in particular, the strongest and biggest naval power in the world, the United States, that is policing the world's oceans. And it's so superior with its naval power that no other country will catch up anytime soon, right? That's the way the Chinese are building islands in the South China Sea, because they do not have such advanced aircraft carriers. But when there's suddenly a new trade route that opens up in the waters in the north, I think it would be really difficult for the United States to establish a a claim there of policing those waters there as well, because it's only Russia.
Yeah, no, it's impossible. Keep in mind for people, if they imagine the world map, so these trade routes would not go through the North Pole. Obviously, they would go south of the Arctic, which used to be ice, but is very clearly, undeniably, unambiguously Russian territorial waters. So this would be within Russian territory that these trade routes would go. Now, I think for the world, that's not at all a problem. But from a Western geopolitical perspective, that all of a sudden gives an awful lot of influence and power to Moscow. And it is in that context that you have to be skeptical and even cynical of those articles talking about military conflict. You know, the West always tries to pretend that they're the peacekeepers, but in fact, they're the ones who feel comfortable using the military to achieve certain goals. And they have done this over and over again. And they seem to want to kind of escalate the story, right? They want to escalate the situation to a place where either there is some kind of demilitarization and some kind of neutralization of geopolitical power, so like a UN commission being responsible for Arctic affairs and therefore also for trade lanes, or some kind of geopolitical tension where NATO can play its military part.
Did you just say like a somewhat neutral organization when you spoke about the UN there?
Yeah, I misspoke. My sincere apologies to you and all the listeners. No, a Western-dominated United Nations, at least for the moment, still. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what the West wants, right? They want to pretend that it's like a neutral global initiative, but of course they want to pull the strings, and it's quite interesting because there's nothing that Russia has done in itself with respect to the Arctic to make it look aggressive or anything. It's just waiting for the ice to melt. You know?
Oh, a baller. They did plant a green flag in 2007. I read about that. It was highly controversial that a Russian submarine went there and planted a green flag. That's a very aggressive move.
Yeah, I mean, there are some there's some territorial disputes here and there. There's some symbolism. Of course, the Arctic has been always an important part of Soviet and nowadays Russian naval strategizing doctrine because they've got their most important naval bases in the north. But this change that we're witnessing about greater natural resources being available in the Arctic and trade routes becoming more accessible is not something that Russia has forced upon the world. It's just something that essentially, ironically, Western pollution and CO2 emissions leading to global warming have caused.
Absolutely. By the way, I misspoke. Of course, it wasn't a green flag. It was a Russian flag within a green area. So it would make sense for the Russians to plant a green flag. So that's basically one of the big reasons, right, is the new trade routes. And then the other one, another thing you do by planting a flag is obviously claiming ownership of a territory, and with that also its resources. And that's something that also happened in the early 2000s, that a lot of natural resources, particularly gas and oil, were discovered in the region. Hey, who doesn't want the money?
Of course. Now, there is an awful lot of expectations on the Arctic and resources, as in there's a belief that there is a significant oil reserves, other kinds of metals that can be found that were basically off limits until now, that were impossible to get to. The geopolitical consequences of that are more related to the global economy rather than direct tensions, mostly, I would argue, because most of those resources are already in well-defined territories. So there is, for people who don't know, there's the core around, if you like, the North Pole, that is not territorial, is not claimed, is purposefully not claimed by anyone. But most of what we call the Arctic region has clearly defined borders, has clearly defined areas that are part of Westphalian territories. And that is also where most of the resources are likely to be found. Therefore, the fact that now the Arctic is going to provide greater natural resources to the world is going to have an impact on global economics. It's going to have an impact on the global south, which are traditionally the natural resource producers. So therefore it is relevant, but it is unlikely to be the cause of direct tensions for the simple reason that I don't think anyone can dispute the main fault lines, borders that have been established for a long time.
And if things go good, right, and the world relies less and less on fossil fuels, right, that might not be so lucrative in the future.
Right, then you're still looking at other kinds of metals that might be important for technology and those kinds of things. But yeah, in a world where it's not unlikely that oil will rapidly become less geopolitically relevant and economically relevant, hopefully that will solve itself in that way, right? Yeah. So I think the main argument, the main concern that you will find within NATO and elsewhere is the trade lane aspect, is the fact that all of a sudden there is a geopolitical shift towards how the global economy works rather than simple money, right?
Yeah. And so far, all the problems surrounding the Arctic have usually been resolved. Well, I don't know if usually, but I think usually been resolved diplomatically, either through bilateral relations, right? It goes back a long time, or through multilateral relations, right? So the Arctic Council, which comprises exactly of those countries that are basically directly involved, and it has multiple observer states, right? And as you mentioned before, these observer states they just happen to be mostly Western. There's Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, right? The UK, France, Spain. But then you have China, India, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Switzerland. So I would say 3 of them we usually consider non-Western.
Yeah, and you include India there then, and that is, India is already a little bit in a gray area, right? Previously it was considered Western, at least an ally of the West. Nowadays it isn't, but it's a very clear sign of the world that we're coming from. Basically, if you were the West or very good friends with the West, you got a seat at the table. If you weren't, then life became difficult. There was, for Russia, it would have made perfect sense to put Kazakhstan there or whatever, landlocked country, for geopolitical purposes. But of course, that was never going to happen in a Western-dominated world. But it is important to observe that, right? It's important to observe that these international bodies still have a very clear Western dominance.
And when we look at how this council has worked in the past, so in the last 2.5 years, it has been a bit difficult to say the least, because all those Western nations said we're not going to attend any sessions that Russia will be heading in that sense. Right, it was kind of another way to isolate Russia from diplomacy.
Which is, by the way, exactly the problem, right? This is an Arctic Council. This is not the UN General Assembly. It's not the UN Security Council. It is an Arctic Council that is there to streamline, to facilitate good relations within the Arctic so that it doesn't lead to unnecessary tension and conflict. With all those nations, Western nations, saying we are not going to engage with Russia on the Arctic because of Ukraine or because of whatever else they do, is completely abusing that platform. That is not a political platform. That's why we have the General Assembly and Security Council for those things. They don't work perfectly, but that's what they are there for. The Arctic Council is not here as an arbiter for global morality. It is here to streamline events in the Arctic. And the West using that tool, or I would argue abusing that tool for something completely different, namely putting pressure on Russia, is actually very disturbing and is very aggressive. Is the kind of behavior that typically should not be condoned, because the Arctic, in that sense, has nothing to do with Ukraine, has nothing to do with all these other types of conflicts and rivalries. It's a separate issue, and the way that the West adopts those kinds of mechanisms to push for their own political perspectives is, of course, very concerning.
Another aspect when it comes to how this council operates, and it's actually a reoccurring theme within this podcast, is to what extent Western powers participate in the diplomatic exchange, right? So this council is exists exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, right? To kind of settle disputes peacefully, and that also goes for obviously territorial claims, right? So Russia is usually submitting a claim, then Canada and Denmark are saying, "Oh no, you know what? This is actually ours," and they submit a claim themselves. One country that I expected to submit a lot of claims was the United States, but then I read that they can't. Do you know? Do you want to know? Or I mean, well, you're educated, you are a professor. You know why they can't submit any claims. Why is that?
No, Dario, feel free to educate us. I've been talking plenty, so I can see from your face that you're very enthusiastic about this. So please go on.
I am, because it makes me so happy, right? Is that because basically submitting claims to a UN commission here, for this there is basically a UN treaty that you need to sign. But signing itself is not enough. You also need to ratify it. And the United States is the only country out of those 8 that hasn't ratified the treaty. And it makes me incredibly happy, right? Because it really exposes all of that hypocritical talk that I usually dislike so much about US foreign policy.
It's so fascinating, right? All these things. You can see the same with international law, right? Which is in many ways very much a US driven construct, right? The the international legal processes, conventions that have been put in place ever since the Second World War are very much driven by the United States, but over and over again, you run into this problem that the United States, despite shaping the world into its own image, doesn't want to commit fully by ratifying, doesn't want to commit fully by essentially limiting its own power, and therefore then it runs into all these practical problems. The same with the landmine treaty, the same with the ICC, the ICJ, all those kinds of mechanisms that are so American in their nature are actually are kind of off limits for the United States because of this exact reason. It's fascinating, but it's also, if I were an American citizen, I would be highly disturbed by this, because it makes your government basically not being able to protect your interest in the best way possible.
Exactly, in the best way possible, right? Which is through non-military means, I would claim. A theory that I have also, maybe a reason why the United States is not as involved there and didn't ratify the treaty, is because the US doesn't really have any serious territorial claims, right? I mean, because for the US it's really just Alaska that they bought actually of the Russians, right? But when you look at the history of these different claims, there's a very interesting pattern that emerges, because, right, so there's a bit of a claim between Russia and the US, right, in the Bering Sea. But then if you look at some of the other ones at the listings, there's one country that keeps on coming up, right? Because there's also the United States versus Canada. There's Canada versus Denmark. There's Canada and Denmark again. And then there's Canada also kind of struggling with some other countries. Isn't Canada supposed to be one of the good guys?
Yeah. Canada is always portrayed as sort of the polite version of the United States, right? The kinder, friendlier version where people say please and thank you. Canada is the second most important player in terms of territory, right? After Russia. And you would absolutely expect Canada to take a slightly calmer approach, but they have. You're absolutely right. They have been the most aggressive, sort of most confrontational player of the past few decades. That is because a lot of their identity is connected to it in ways that maybe the identity of, let's say, a country like Denmark isn't, right? And even the United States. The United States has so many interests that the Arctic and Alaska are just one of many in a list. But for Canada, it's much more fundamental to their geopolitical position, as well as how they perceive themselves on the world stage. But that is a very fascinating contrast with respect to Russia, because Russia actually has done relatively well diplomatically. Not everything, there are still some disputes that Russia is part of, but they have been able to communicate constructively and come up with agreements with Norway, with Denmark, with other players without too much fuss. And in that sense, this idea that you've got sort of the peace-loving diplomatic nations of the West versus the aggressive Russian Federation is, of course, nonsense. That is not the reality that we perceive in the Arctic. In the Arctic, it's Canada that is kind of the bad boy, the one that is not particularly liked in its approach by the other members, whereas Russia is quite constructive in most cases.
And as a result of this, Canada is one of the main players pushing for further militarization of the Arctic, right? So, kind of asking for the North American Aerospace Defense Command to be modernized, other things, right? Just introduced, very active in all of this, also trying to get the United States further involved through NATO, also the Europeans. It's interesting because, right? I mean, this might be a naive question here, but how would a war in the Arctic work? I mean, it it almost seems a little bit pointless, right? Because there's a lot of nothing. It's very loosely populated. No one's really there. And the only thing I feel like the only thing you could do is who can build I don't know who can drill for oil the fastest, and then build an oil platform or something, and then maybe those platforms get destroyed, right? That's the only form of real military conflict I could think of.
Yeah, well, there's lots to unpack here. Let me first start by saying that despite this image that we just mentioned, Canada does have quite an aggressive track record when it comes to sort of militarizing foreign policy in ways that maybe seem less obvious than the United States militarization of foreign policy, but it's still very much there. Don't forget that Canada is also at the basis of the responsibility to protect, for example, which is essentially a way of saying we have not just a right, but also a duty to intervene in societies militarily if we feel that those societies are not protecting their own children, their own citizen and children as well. And in Canada's case, that is quite an aggressive position, right? Basically, Canada is very much a child of the Western bubble, is very much a country that follows that mentality of we are the good guys. And as a result, we've got an inherent right to be aggressive in our foreign policy in ways that a country like Russia doesn't have because of the internal nature of Russia. Now, when it comes to your military questions, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, and I should probably give a shout out here to a student whose thesis I supervised last year. I never know if people are comfortable with me naming them, but I would say hi Zach. I hope you're listening to this. With Zach, I supervised this paper last year, which was an amazing paper on exactly this question of what does military confrontation look like in the Arctic? What are the actual scenarios that exist? And you're absolutely right. It's very unlikely that a full-scale war would occur in the Arctic itself. If war were to occur in the Arctic, that would be a part of a much larger global war, right? Why would Russia and the United States, say, or Russia and NATO, fight only in the Arctic and not in the Pacific and not in the Atlantic? That doesn't make any sense. The most likely scenarios are relatively small-scale military skirmishes, if we talk about military intervention, or just intimidation, military intimidation, putting assets on the ground to say, this is ours, back off, right? A little bit like what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis, like just trying to intimidate the opponent in giving in. So yes, the chances of a full-blown war in the Arctic that hasn't spread or hasn't started elsewhere on the globe is very unlikely. Having said that, the analysis of what currently the military capabilities are is a fascinating one, and I think that a lot of people don't realize the sort of the asymmetry between the two sides in that regard.
Because I mean, there's right. So Russia has, I mean, basically machines, ships readily available to, to move onto the Arctic, right? So because I mean, when we previously talked about this, we basically said, well, within the first day, Russia would conquer or control very quickly a lot of territory, because again, there is no one there to stop them. There's also not a lot of nature that can stop them, right? It's basically just go through. You have icebreakers, right? Like these big ships that can go through ice. So it would be a very boring first day. But then after 2-3 days, the United States, or also NATO, which doesn't have any presence in the region, then they would arrive with all their big boats and airplanes, and that would be very interesting the other way around.
Yeah, so and it goes very much hand in hand with a broader analysis of military doctrine. So Russian military doctrine is also something that you could see in the war in Ukraine, is about slow movement, of slow conquest, slow infrastructure build-up, etc. And in the Arctic, that's exactly what the Soviet Union and nowadays Russia have been doing, slowly building up enormous infrastructure. In terms of, you mentioned icebreakers, they've got about 50 icebreakers, which is way more than any NATO country. It's in terms of naval bases, most of their naval capabilities are centered around their northern fleets, which are obviously right in the Arctic. So Russia has military assets in the Arctic, which NATO doesn't. NATO does have a few things, but nothing compared to Russia. But NATO, and especially US military doctrine, is very much about quick deployment. So they don't have a fleet in the Arctic, but they've got a fleet in the Atlantic. And that is formally responsible for the East Coast, but would be easy to deploy into the Arctic in 2 or 3 days, exactly as you said. And therefore, you've got this mismatch, this asymmetry in military capabilities. Russia has infrastructure focused purely on the Arctic that can't be used in the Pacific or elsewhere. And NATO has very little infrastructure there, but has infrastructure elsewhere that can be deployed very quickly. And that means that any conversation about demilitarization of the Arctic is a conversation that is very favorable to NATO, because they would love to have a demilitarized Arctic, because that would basically mean taking down 70 years of Russian-Soviet buildup, and taking down maybe this one small airstrip that Canada has somewhere, and that's about it. Knowing that NATO can quickly deploy whenever necessary. So Russia obviously would always claim in such conversations, in such debates, okay, if we're going to talk about demilitarizing the Arctic, we have to talk about global demilitarization. We're going to have to talk about demilitarizing the Second Fleet of the United States, which is, of course, a no-go area for the US. And therefore, we have to be careful within a Western bubble perspective to think that people calling for demilitarization are politically neutral, like war is bad, military is bad, therefore surely we can all agree that we shouldn't militarize the Arctic. Well, actually, we can only agree to that if we are Western. The Russians have a very different perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole theme with I feel like this entire, I don't want to call it conflict in the Arctic, right? But it's, I mean, calling for more diplomacy, maybe through the United Nations, a completely neutral body that does not have any Western influence at all, or right by demilitarizing, which obviously clearly favors one overall military doctrine over the other.
And this is kind of the wool that when the Western bubble pulls over our eyes. It is the lie that we are being told as truth. This idea that the West continuously are the ones who are just trying to talk and make it about international organizations and are peace-loving and aren't aggressive, whereas in reality they dominate the organizations that they claim to be neutral, and they are incredibly aggressive in their stance very often. That is a very, very good example, sort of a microcosm, the Arctic as a microcosm of the Western bubble in general, where there is a narrative on the one hand and a reality on the other hand, and those two don't coincide.
Well, this seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the geopolitics of the Arctic. Now that topic has a Wikipedia article and a Western bubble episode, so the topic is doing really good for itself. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake that we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
This is a quote by Brian Mulroney, who is a former Prime Minister of Canada. And it's not a philosophical quote about life or humanity, but it goes back to what we said previously, namely that countries, in this case Canada, behave according to their own geopolitical interest. They become aggressive because they are attached to a specific topic, not because they are not democratic or authoritarian or something like that. And this quote by Brian Mulroney very much emphasizes that, right? How closely Canada feels connected to the Arctic. It goes, "The Prime Minister earlier this year talked about the importance of the Arctic to our future. He is right. 100 years from now, the strength of Canada is going to be coming from our resources in the Arctic.